Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996. Welcome back to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. Before we hear from our speaker, our tradition is to go around and introduce ourselves first. If I could suggest, take a moment, breathe before rattling off all of our names. So maybe a slight little pause, be mindful of your name as well as everyone else. And before we do that, just by a show of hands, is there anyone here for the first time? Welcome, 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 welcome. We'll try and remember your names as we go around and make you feel welcome at the social period afterwards. My name's Tom.
Douglas.
Vinny. Michael.
My name is Rich.
And my name is Philip.
Harley.
Patrick.
Jonathan.
Jeffrey.
Lee.
My name is Mark.
Andy.
Michael.
John.
My name is Jerry.
My name is Jerry.
My name is David.
I'm Brad.
John.
I'm Michael.
I'm Jack.
My name is Cass.
Dennis. My name is Henry.
My name is Paul.
My name is Rod.
Peter.
Doug.
My name is Jeff.
My name is Roy.
I'm Hal.
Richard.
Peter.
Jason.
Jay.
Our speaker today is Jeffrey Schneider. Jeffrey is a priest at the San Francisco Zen Center, where he has lived, worked, and practiced since 1978. He is currently the coordinator of Zen Center's outreach programs and founded in 2000 the Buddhist recovery programs at the center. Jeffrey has offered retreats and teachings in a variety of Northern California venues, as well as in Texas, Missouri, South Carolina, and Virginia. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to express my gratitude for being invited to speak to you. It's been a while, and I always enjoy being here. So thanks to Jeff and to Tom, especially. Can you all hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay, so if I start to fade, do something. to alert me, yes. So I would like to start, first of all, with a caveat and an apology. So the apology is that since I know very few of you, just a couple of you really, I don't really know if what I'm going to say is going to be so basic that it will seem, why is he saying that, or so complicated that it's like, doesn't he know I'm a beginner? So, not knowing really the level of familiarity with Buddhist concepts that y'all have as a group, I'm going to try to hit the middle, and I will probably not succeed so often, but maybe I will. And when I hear something, I would rather have somebody talk over my level than down to me. So we'll see what happens. The caveat is that everything I'm going to say is wrong. And I'm not saying that in like some sense of false humility or just to be cute, although thank you for the laughs. But rather because it's actually true. So anything I say today could also be said in quite a different way, or from a different perspective, or using different information. And that would be, even though it contradicts or might contradict what I'm saying, it could also be true as well. So that's the caveat. So over the years, and I've been practicing Buddhism, well, as Tom said, I came to Zen Center in 1978, but I was also practicing or trying to practice on my own for since I was a teenager, basically. And so over the years, what I've discovered is that Buddhism, particularly in the last few years, has not really gone so far as to answer my questions, but rather as to sharpen and focus them. So you're not going to get any answers today. Maybe you will, but they won't come from me. Any answers today. And one of the things that I enjoy about being invited to speak is that it's a challenge for me to talk about what's been going on in my practice, to do a little bit more in-depth investigation, and then to bring it forward. And hopefully, the most interesting part of today, of this morning's event, will be the discussion we have after I quit talking. So I hope that there will be time I will try to leave as much time for that as possible. So what I want to talk about today is what is usually translated as enlightenment, bodhi. And it's probably a more accurate translation to translate it not as enlightenment, but as awakening. There's a slight difference there, So the Buddha, Buddha is cognate with the word bodhi, was the one who woke up, the guy who woke up. And enlightenment sounds like some sort of permanent, unalterable state. Like I got on the train and I got off in Cincinnati. That's kind of what enlightenment sounds like to me. Cincinnati. I've only been there once, and I wasn't real impressed, but it was a long time ago. But anyhow, so, I think that on some level or another, we're all kind of, those of us who have been hooked into Buddhism have been hooked by the notion of enlightenment or awakening or whatever we think that is. When I was a kid, like maybe in 7th grade, actually it wasn't 7th grade, I remember going through the encyclopedia. I was one of those kind of kids. And seeing a picture of a Buddhist monk sitting in meditation and thinking, oh, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And then kind of like having the second thought, well, like, oh, I can't do that, I'm not Asian. Fortunately, you don't have to be Asian. But what spoke to me was there was something sort of like deeply... I felt a deep affinity with the picture of that guy sitting in meditation. And it also spoke to me of some craving I had for some sort of fundamental transformation in my life. I wasn't quite sure, but some inexpressible change that I was looking for, some overwhelming experience, an overwhelming answer to the overwhelming question, which of course can never really be articulated so well. So I wanted to be essentially somebody else. I wanted an end to my suffering. And, I was not necessarily looking or even aware of something like wisdom or compassion. I think what I was looking for was something like spiritual heroin. Something that would just like make it all go. I've never had heroin, but I understand it makes it all go away. A friend of mine who was a former heroin addict said to me once, "It's a good thing, Jeffrey, that you never tried it." So that's what I wanted. I wanted some transformation. I yearned for some fundamental and instantaneous, preferably, transformation. I didn't realize hardly anything except that there was some craving in me. Many years ago, I was very fortunate to hear the Dalai Lama speak in a relatively small setting. And one of the things that he said that really sort of blew my mind was he said that wisdom arises out of compassion, right? So I always thought it was the other way around if I thought about it at all. Like, I was at Zen Center by this time. I do all this really hard, meditation practice, and then I'd get enlightened, and I'd be wise, and then I could have compassion for you poor schmucks that didn't get it, right? Because, obviously you were just much too annoying right now. But, so anyhow, over the years as I practiced, or tried to practice, or studied, or tried to study, or doing whatever it is I'm doing, I'm a little bit less hooked by the idea of enlightenment. It's not so much the end-all and be-all and call that it was. And some years ago, I was studying a particular strain of Buddhism, and they came across the idea of an achantaka. So an achantaka, according to some strains of what we call Yogacara Buddhism, is a being who is completely lacking in the ability ever to become a Buddha. Never become a Buddha. No ground of enlightenment whatsoever. And I thought, aha, it's my way out. So, So if I identify as an achantaka, I can let go of a sort of greedy idea of awakening, enlightenment. But, so that brings up the question, at least for me, when we talk about awakening or enlightenment, what are we talking about? Really, what are we talking about? Can we talk about it? Well, I don't know if we can talk about it, but we can certainly talk about the ways in which it has been talked about. And, some of the questions that immediately arise are, not only what is it, but is it real? Or is it a pious fantasy? Is it something that is available to us as human beings? And if it is, how is that possibly available to us? So it's been, I want to just give a little bit of an overview. And this is where you should take it with many grains of salt, because I'm simplifying greatly and, I'm not a great scholar. But in the oldest strain of Buddhist teaching that we have available to us, which are the Pali Suttas, and the Pali Suttas were written down 200 to 300 years after the Buddha died, okay, in a language that he didn't speak. So, we don't really know what the Buddha said, right? We know what the oral transmission was, maybe until they were written down. But in the oldest strain of what we have available to us, awakening or enlightenment is more or less equated with nirvana, right? Nirvana. So, although with a little bit of a twist, because in the Pali Suttas, the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha's awakening, is treated as qualitatively and quantitatively different than the enlightenment available to his followers, to the so-called arhats. So an arhat is a person who has followed the Buddhist teaching in the Buddhist way to become an enlightened person, an enlightened man or woman. And there's always a divide though in the early teachings between the Buddha and the arhat. So the Buddha gets all sorts of cool stuff like omniscience and pretty much omnipotence of some sort, but the arhats don't. I remember early on studying Buddhism, I had this sort of visual image of the Buddha and his disciples walking in the same direction, but separated by kind of a river. Walking in the same direction, but separated. And so also in the early teachings, there's no place that I've ever been able to find, and I pretty much read most of the Pali Suttas, where the idea of Buddhahood is held up as an ideal for the practitioner. Okay? In no place does the Buddha encourage his disciples to go for it. What he says is, what I teach is suffering and the end of suffering, and kind of let the rest of it go. So, but even in the early Pali Suttas, enlightenment and nirvana are spoken of in sort of different ways, sort of maybe even contradictory ways. So the simplest definition of nirvana in the early suttas is that nirvana is the complete dying away without remainder of greed, hatred, and delusion. The three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And so that's pretty simple. I mean, hard to do, but simple to understand, right? And so greed, hatred, and delusion is so called the three poisons, but actually, essentially, what they are is they're strategies for protection of the self, right? I'm going to protect myself by getting a lot of stuff around me, whether it's love, money, food, sex, fame, cars, whatever. Hatred or aversion is I'm going to protect myself by making sure that nothing gets close enough to hurt me. And delusion is like, it's all just too fucking much. I'm going to watch TV or whatever delusive state we choose to go into. But it's also spoken of nirvana as attaining or achieving or even going to, in some way, some absolute state. So here is what one of the Pali Suttas says about that. There is the unborn, uncreated, unconditioned, and unformed. If there were not, there would be no escape discerned from that which is born, created, conditioned, and formed. But since there is this unborn, uncreated, unconditioned, and unformed, escape is therefore discerned from that which is born, created, conditioned, and formed. So what we're talking about here is basically some absolute, as opposed to what we experience here. So nirvana is quite seen as quite separate and quite other than samsara. Samsara is this world of greed, hatred, and delusion in which we have our being, by and large. So early Buddhism is very very dualistic in many ways. But then there's another slightly different take, and this is also once again from the early Pali Suttas. So the Buddha's talking to somebody, and he's talking about a lot of the Pali Suttas are sort of like Q&A or discussion between the Buddha and various people. So the Buddha says, just as if there were a roofed house or a roofed hall having windows on the north, the south, or the east, when the sun rises and a shaft of light has entered by way of the window, where does it land? And his interlocutor says, on the western wall, Venerable Sir. And if there is no western wall, on the ground, Venerable Sir. And if there is no ground, on the water, Venerable Sir. And if there is no water, it does not land, Venerable Sir. In the same way, says the Buddha, when there is no passion for physical nutriment, contact, consciousness, or intention, consciousness does not land or grow. That, I tell you, is quite free from sorrow, affliction, or despair. So what it seems to be positing here is some unconditioned consciousness that is primal and that we presumably have access with practice. So for me, that brings up the question of whether an unconditioned consciousness is possible or believable. I think pretty much any modern thinker, any philosopher, any psychologist would say that no, the idea of an unconditioned consciousness is not possible, because of course everything in my consciousness seems to be conditioned by my senses, my personal history, my genetic makeup, my culture, my blah 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 blah, ad infinitum, and often ad nauseum. So the idea of something that is take all of that away and there is some unconditioned consciousness, this is the question. This is the question. So one of the other things that's interesting about nirvana and enlightenment in early Buddhism is that it's always spoken of as a specific temporal event. It happens at some point. It's first you're not enlightened, and then you are. So it's spoken of as a breakthrough event, perhaps. It's a radical change, but it's a radical change not only in perspective, but also in ontology. In other words, not just how we see things, but how we are. So a person who is touched, become awakened, enlightened, whatever, is no longer subject to birth and death. to the constant cycle of becoming, whether it's literally taking new body, or whether it's continuously involved in the cycle of greed, hatred, and delusion. So we become different, in theory, so I'm told, in how we actually are. So sometimes it's difficult to pin down, but Buddhism, especially early on, and for quite a while into the Mahayana, it actually is quite puts a lot of value on reason and logic. It may not seem like it, but it really does. That the teaching is rational, the teaching can be approached rationally, logically, and that there are rational ways to get from point A to point B. It follows. It's not mystical in a sense. So, a mystical practice is where you sort of hope for something, to come and flood you from elsewhere. But rather, it's a yogic practice in that it has a way to get there that is intelligible. So the Buddha spoke a lot about how things come to be, conditioned co-arising. What is required for this to exist? Well, that is required for this to exist, yes. And what is required for that to exist? Prior to that, there has to be this. And, so we don't get back essentially to a first cause so much as we do to an identifiable cycle. This is what what we speak of in Buddhism as, conditioned co-arising, that all things come up because of the thing before them. And that is an intelligible sort of thing. And this is another way that we speak of, early Buddhism speaks of becoming awakened, understanding the nature of this cycle, and how, therefore, to break into the cycle. And even in the early Mahayana, this for quite a while, even though anybody who's read any of the Mahayana scriptures, like the Perfection of Wisdom, you got Buddhas coming out of the walls, glowing in 12 different colors, moving mountains and being very, essentially very psychedelic. But even in the midst of this, there's still, as far as practice goes, there's still this understanding that it is somehow intelligible. So let me read you a little bit. This is from a fellow named Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna lived around the 2nd or 3rd century, I think about the 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era. And he is considered in pretty much every subsequent school of Buddhism, one of the most important thinkers since the Buddha. So I will just read you a little bit of what he has to say here. Nirvana is not a thing. Then it would follow that it would have the characteristics of aging and death. There does not exist any thing that is without aging and death. If nirvana were a thing, nirvana would be a conditioned phenomena. There does not exist anything anywhere that is not a conditioned phenomena. If nirvana were a thing, how would nirvana not be dependent? There does not exist anything at all that is not dependent. If nirvana were not a thing, how could it possibly be nothing? The one for whom nirvana is not a thing, for him it is not no thing. If nirvana were no thing, how could nirvana possibly be not dependent? There does not exist any no thing which is not dependent. So on a reading, if you don't have time to sit down with the text, it may sound a little confusing, but it's actually quite logical. The Nagarjuna is examining the nature of codependent arising here. And yet, further down in the same thing, just a few stanzas down, he says, samsara, and remember samsara is this world of greed, hatred, and delusion, samsara does not have the slightest distinction from nirvana. Nirvana does not have the slightest distinction from samsara. Whatever is the end of nirvana, that is the end of samsara. There is not even a very subtle, slight distinction between the two. So this occasions a sort of a major watershed in Buddhism. It triggers the major shift from a very dualistic understanding, nirvana, samsara, we're trying to get out of samsara into nirvana, it collapses these both into a non-dualist system, and this collapse of dualism into sort of a singleness is very much bound up with the notion of Buddha nature. And of course, the teaching of Buddha nature works itself out in different ways over different times in different schools. Sometimes it is seen as a potential. Okay, so all of us, all beings, have the potential to become awakened, to become Buddhists. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it is something innate. It's already there, but it must be somehow uncovered or realized. And this is what we find. This understanding is what we find primarily in the Zen school. You know, I don't know. I know that you come from a variety and practice in a variety of different traditions, but you know, sort of in the Zen school, that is the understanding that the Buddha nature is already there, inherent, and needs to be simply understood. And there are some, by the way, who argue that the notion of Buddha nature is heretical. Particularly the so-called critical Buddhist school in Japan, which exists, you know, sort of now. The major writing was done like in the 1990s, which sees it as a return to the idea of a permanent self, which of course is one of the no-nos in Buddhism. So anyhow, but the potential in some later forms of Buddhism expresses itself not only the potential for full Buddhahood, but also, as I said, you know, you've got the Achantikas who have no potential for Buddhahood, and then you've got, you know, people who can only achieve lesser forms of enlightenment. So it's, you know, the idea of Buddha nature is all very sort of all around the block, and it expresses itself over time and in different schools and cultures in different ways. So, you know, as I said, in Zen, it's understood. So there's a very important saying in Zen that this very mind is Buddha. And of course, later on in 13th century Japan, Dogen Zenji, who was the founder of the Soto school, in which I practice, talks about not practice leading to realization, but he talks about practice realization as one thing. That our practice of specifically like meditation is something that we do not to become awakened, but as an expression of the awakening that is part and parcel of what we are. There's a dark side to this, by the way. The understanding of original enlightenment. So, like, we're all already awakened Buddhists. Isn't that lovely? And you know, it goes further on that not only sentient beings, but insentient beings. You know, the flowers, the wooden altar, the teacup. You know, all already awakened and you know, luminous with Buddha nature. Well, that's lovely. Except there, as I said, there are problems with that. If everything is already Buddha nature and lovely and wonderful, there's no, you know, why bother with things like social justice, right? Because, you know, you're already Buddha. All you have to do is realize it. Yeah, well, okay, you're poor and stinking and, you know, oppressed, but, you know, you're Buddha, right? There's a story I read once, and I can't remember where it was, and I hope it's not true, but I have a feeling that it probably is. That, you know, so there's this monastery in Japan or something, and somebody comes to the gate and banging on the gate, and they open it, and it's like, I'm starving! And the abbot goes, he already has Buddha nature. That's enough. So, I hope he appreciated that, the beggar. Actually, speaking of beggars coming to the door, let me just tell you a little story because I like it, not because it necessarily has a lot. There's a story that I read once. I have no idea whether it's true or not, but it's about St. Francis of Assisi. And so the story goes like this. He and his one of his companions are walking down the road, and it's a dark and stormy night, right? It's raining, it's crappy, they're up to their ankles in mud, they haven't eaten, blah, blah, blah. And so up ahead of them they see a building, a monastery. And Francis turns to his companion and says, "Brother, do you want to know what perfect happiness is?" Duh. So you know, his friend says, "Well, of course." And then, "Okay, come with me." And they go and they rap on the door, and they rap on the door. Finally somebody opens the door and says, "Do you have any idea what time it is?" And Francis says, "Excuse me, brother, but we're travelers, and we're tired, and we're cold, and we're hungry." And the guy says, "I am so tired of you guys just coming in and asking for handouts all the time. Go away!" Slams the door. And Francis looks at his companion and says, "And that, brother, is perfect happiness." The story, I think, the moral of that story, as the Duchess said to Alice, I think is something like Buddha nature. Francis threw himself into the absolute in spite of conditions. And so sometimes Buddha nature is spoken of as that way, as an absolute that overrides the relative. And sometimes it's spoken of in other ways. So, this very mind is Buddha. There's another way of understanding this awakening that I like, or that I'm very interested in these days. And this is the way it is expressed in what is so-called Pure Land Buddhism. And I have something to read to you, and here it is. So, as some of you may know, the Pure Land Buddhism bases itself on the vows of Amida Buddha. So, Amida Buddha is not historical, but the story goes that a bazillion years ago, there was this dude, and he met a Buddha, and he said, "I'm going to become a Buddha too, no matter how long it takes." But then he made a series of vows, right? And one of the vows is, there are a series of 48 vows, but the most important one is that when I become awakened, I will create a pure land, and those who call upon my name as a fully awakened Buddha will be reborn into that pure land, where it is easy to become awakened. And so this has worked itself out in many ways, but in Japan it involves recitation of the name of Amida Buddha. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And for many years, with my Zen snobbishness, I always thought, oh, well, that's just like folk religion for people, who can't handle the real thing, little old ladies in black, of whatever denomination, right? But actually, I've come to see how beautiful it is as a teaching and a practice. And because, what's interesting is that unlike other forms of Buddhism where we try to attain whatever it is we're looking to attain through meditation, through study, through many practices, this is something that is entirely based upon faith and trust, upon giving oneself over completely to the Absolute, sort of like Francis did at that moment when he said, "This is perfect happiness, brother." And one of the great teachers of Pure Land Buddhism in Japan is a guy named Shinran, who his dates are 1173 to 1262. So he's coincident with Dogen Zenji, who founded the particular form of Zen that I'm involved with. So this is what Shinran has to say, and this is Shinran's understanding of the primal vow. So this is the vow that I just told you about. Thus, when one has boarded the ship of the vow of great compassion and sailed out on the vast ocean of light, the winds of perfect virtue blow softly and the waves of evil are transformed. The darkness of ignorance is immediately broken through, and quickly reaching the land of immeasurable light, one realizes great nirvana. So I think that is really, really a very beautiful thing to say. And I think it's also, in many ways, much more difficult than some of the practices that we do in other forms of Buddhism, to give oneself over in sort of an absolute moment of trust. I mean, I can't do that. I'm not spiritually advanced enough for that kind of folk religion. But I find it very beautiful and very compelling. So anyhow, where does this leave us? There's many different understandings of what awakening means, what enlightenment means, what nirvana means, what the goal of our practice means. And so what do we do with all these different things? Are they all true? is just one of them true and the others are not quite as true? Are none of them true? If some sort of enlightenment is the declared goal of Buddhism, it would seem important to have a sense of what it is and how to get there from here. And so as I said, my study just sharpens my questions. And so some of them are like, is there indeed some objective truth that enlightenment reaches? Or does it only affect the person in a subjective sort of way, regardless of the formulation of how we speak about it? And is one dependent upon the other? So the question then becomes for me is like, is the goal of our practice simply about personal transformation? Or is it about reaching some objective truth that is beyond whether we are transformed by it or not? And so if it's the latter, if it's about simply personal transformation, does it matter at all what path we take as long as it leads us there? So, for example, I find the truth claims of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, things that I can't buy into, right? I mean, I can't, I don't believe in a God, okay? That's pretty standard Buddhist fare. But, and yet, I have met people of other faith traditions who do believe in things that I find totally, unlikely, who are much more, shall we say, spiritually transformed than I find myself to be, right? So is the object coming to some sort of objective truth, or is the object personal transformation? And if it is, does it matter what you practice? And so why practice Buddhism, right? Can we even begin to speak of truth that is not relative? Can we begin to do we even have language to speak of a truth that is absolute, objective? And if so, how can we get there? And if a truth of such sort exists, how can we even begin to speak of it, to put it into language? So I think for me, these questions about the truth claims of Buddhism, and then of course what kind of Buddhism are we talking about? Enlightenment, awakening, the path to there. All of these, have consequences, I believe, for how we practice and how we decide to follow, a Buddhist path. I haven't answered any of these questions, either for myself or I'm quite sure for you. But these are some of the questions I have for you. And now, the most important part is, what do you think? That's all I've got to say, so. Oh, this is not, this was advertised as Q&A, but it's not Q&A. Okay, I want you to enlighten me.
I'm glad none of us.
I'm sorry. I'm going to invite people to say their name again.
Okay.
So just so we can get to know each other, because, thanks.
My name is Cass. Thank you for a very provocative talk, and I'm glad none of what you said is true, because I've been wrestling with, especially one of the early things that you said, like making a distinction between nirvana and enlightenment. And it seems like nirvana has, when I think about it now, it's kind of like that's maybe a place that I was going to get to, and enlightenment is what I would be like when I got there. And so, but I'm kind of curious about what the distinction is, because it seems like they're sort of the same thing, but they're sort of different.
Well, as I said, in early Buddhism, they were pretty much equated. In later Buddhism, they're not so much. So, for example, I didn't talk about this, but in what we call the Mahayana, the so-called Great Vehicle Buddhism, there is something called the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva vow. One becomes a Bodhisattva by taking the Bodhisattva vow. So Bodhisattva, it's a compound word, and Bodhi, as you recall, means something like awakening, and Sattva means being, like human being. And so the Bodhisattva is one who vows to become awakened for the benefit of all beings, and yet without going into final nirvana. So the Bodhisattva vows to remain as an awakened being in the world of suffering for the benefit of all beings, to lead them all to awakening. And, so my Bodhisattva vow means, even in some unimaginable, circumstance, if I became awakened, I would still remain in the world. And it also means that even struggling to understand awakening, we remain in the world. And that we work for the benefit of all beings, even in our own very, ham-handed way. Does that at all respond?
Well, it's more to wrestle with.
Yeah. It just gets infinitely more complicated.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thank you. I'm David. I know this is going to sound a little tongue-in-cheek, but I'm just going to kind of say it anyway. Have you ever known anybody who you thought was enlightened or had no suffering? Am I hanging out with the wrong crowd?
The answer to that is yes.
Wrong crowd? And my second question is, what would be wrong with less suffering and more joy rather than something that seems kind of absolute?
Yeah. So let me just tell you. So the closest I've ever come is this. So I am not a woo-woo kind of guy. I don't believe in stuff I can't see, basically, which is one of the reasons I was drawn to Buddhism in the first place. But as I said, I was once very fortunate to hear His Holiness the Dalai Lama speak, and this was in a relatively it was out at Green Gulch Farm, and I think there were probably maybe 200 people in the audience, the assembly, and when he walked into the room, and when he bowed to the altar, I felt something that I'd never felt before. And I normally don't believe that kind of stuff, but I experienced it, and there was some quality of luminosity, and I felt like I was actually dealing with a different order of being, and so that's the closest I've come. So the awakened person is very, very, very rare, right? And there's nothing wrong with less suffering. Less suffering is great. The Buddha said, what I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. So any increments along the way to the end of suffering are excellent. I may not be able to eradicate all of my greed, hate, and delusion, but I may be able to turn the notch down a little bit and create less suffering for myself and for others. And I always like to remind myself that anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Does that respond?
My name is Rich, thank you. So, is there anywhere in Buddhism restraints of, if you use awakening rather than enlightenment, in the sense of awakening at times and going back to sleep, and then awakening a little later and then going back to sleep, and so actually, being in this state, and then, because the sense of enlightenment you often hear about is ding, you're there, and you're there forever, and it would just seem to be based on my own personal experience as well as others that there would definitely be a moving in and out, or it could be. Is that in Buddhism in any strain?
Yeah, in Zen it's talked about to some extent that there are greater or lesser awakening experiences, and that it's not like one time does it, like you flip the switch.
Right.
And I'm trying. When you said that, there was something that there was a quote from Dogen that I was trying to remember about that. When we're awakened, and when we're not awakened, we're not awakened. That's something like that. But yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's often said that like even after, so like you read these stories about the Zen guy who does something and the master slaps him on the back of the head or something, and all of a sudden he has this great awakening experience. What it doesn't tell you in the story, because they're just little vignettes, is that he goes on to practice for another 20 years before he starts teaching, and has various forms of these experiences until they. I think of practice more like learning a language, than going to Cincinnati. Because a language, when we learn a language, we're learning not just vocabulary and grammar, but we're learning a way to see the world and describe the world. So I think that that takes yeah. I think so. Yes, like you said. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for the most commonsensical description of basic Buddhist perspective that I think I've ever heard, and I mean that as high praise and appreciation. And so, what I'm wondering, in a way, this is sort of a minor question about teaching. So it seems to me that the implication of this is that the ordinary level of reality, our existence, could simply be described as illusion. And the alternative is paradox. And yet it isn't usually described that way. And I wonder if that's because it's not very acceptable to us in illusion, or if it's not illusion in your perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure if I quite understand, but let me give it a try. My understanding of Buddhist teaching is that things are not an illusion in the sense of being unreal, but the illusion or the delusion is our misunderstanding of how they really are. So it's not like, there's no cup, there's no whatever that thing is, R2D2, there's no flowers. But the problem is where we misunderstand what they are and how they exist. And so when I talked about earlier dependent co-arising, the reality according to Buddhism is that whatever is arises out of causes and conditions. And when those causes and conditions are exhausted, it ceases to be, or it becomes other. And this is what we mean when we talk about emptiness. So emptiness, for example, does not mean that everything that we see and hear and experience is an illusion and, we have to sort of, negate it. But rather, things are specifically empty of own being. So this cup does not exist on its own, right? So this cup only exists because of the material of which was made, I presume clay of some sort, the cultural construct that likes cups to look like this, this specific gravity. I'm presuming that the elements, the heavier elements of which this cup is made, were like all heavy elements, the detritus of supernovas a bazillion years ago. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we got the cup, and it's nice because it holds water. And I'm thirsty.
So actually, it's quite consistent. So what is illusion is the separate and unchanging nature of reality, and that is in fact what's said.
I think a better word would be delusion, because the delusion is here.
Yeah.
It's not like a magician's sleight of hand. Yeah. So we're not being fooled. We're fooling ourselves. Jeff.
My name's Jeff. Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a wonderful talk. I particularly enjoyed your talking about the dualistic nature of early Buddhism, and that's something that I struggle with in the extended Vipassana retreats practice, feeling like I'm still in the world of objects, the noting and the object. And Ramdas said one time, that as long as we're not resting in a place that doesn't change, we'll be afraid of the place that does. And so I'm always wondering about this difference
He's calling to let you know he changed his mind.
Between consciousness and what is noticing, what's an awareness? I know Buddha nature, or calling it a name gives it, possibility of presumed existence. But it seems like there is. What is that?
I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're asking.
There's seems to be an awareness beyond the objects and the conscious practice of noting and things like that. There's an awareness of things that's unbiased.
So it sounds like what you might be referring to is that bit that I read about the unconditioned consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a lot of strains of Buddhism, they do talk about that either explicitly or implicitly. The idea of the consciousness that is not, stained, or that there is some pure consciousness. The so-called Zen's so-called four statements of its identity, or may not even remember them all. A special transmission outside of the scripture, a special transmission outside of the scriptures, not relying on words and phrases, looking directly into our own mind, seeing own nature and becoming Buddha. The presumption there is that there is something that we can access that is beyond or more, I don't know, beyond or within, something that is prior to specific consciousness. And unborn, uncreated, like he said about nirvana. So, so that's the teachings as it expresses itself in a number of different ways.
Jeffrey, I have to apologize, but I failed to realize that chime meant we're out of time.
Oh,
So, thank you so much for illuminating talk and for not talking down to us. Next week, our speaker will be our own Harley Shapiro, who will present a slideshow, who actually is an anthropologist. I did not know that. And will present a slideshow of his recent adventures in Taiwan, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand. So, a couple of notes and then our announcements. We do have considerable expenses to help us meet here every week. We put out our newsletter, to over half of which are mailed out all over the world to prisoners. And by the way, Jeffrey heads up the outreach programs at the Zen Center, including the umbrella of our own prison pen pal project. So he is instrumental in getting the materials and books to the people that we write to. So we suggest a donation of $10 to help us defray rent and all those other expenses and things like that. Do we have a host?
It's me again. Yes, I'm your host, and there are snacks outside. There is hot water for tea. Wash your cup. I'll be coming around with the giant dongle. And people meet after the social time for lunch. And there's a sign-up sheet on the counter.
Great. So, and please help us make our new guests welcome. Brad, John, Rod, is that right? Who? Peter, Jason, and Andy. Okay.
You're good.
Other announcements?
Yes, this afternoon at 4 o'clock at Calvary Presbyterian at Fillmore and Jackson, the San Francisco Choral Society is performing Bach's indescribably immense Mass in B minor It is a work of great faith and profound consciousness. To be in a room with good singers, good acoustics, in the midst of a Bach fugue is a bath of your whole being. I highly recommend. This piece of work cannot be overpraised, and we did a bang-up job last night. I'll put these flyers up there.
Peter. From the sublime to the
I'm your treasurer, and I printed out a balance sheet for last year, 2013, listing our how much we took in which categories, how much we spent, and our bank balance at the end of December. I sent a sheet of paper out by the Donna Bowl. There's also one from last year, so you can compare 2012 to 2013. And I welcome any questions or challenges.
Any other announcements? Okay.
Oh, I just
Yes.
if I want to issue an apology. I won't be able to stay very long to say hello to you all. I'm in a borrowed car that needs to be back home fairly soon. But
Thank you for being with us.
yeah.
Let's gather in a circle for our meditation.
Getting nothing so far. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.